Okay, this video is from the book The Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes by Pete Rogers. That's me, and we're now going to continue with Aristotle Part 2. So first of all, we left off talking about the Socratic method. The Socratic method of teaching is to ask a bunch of questions. It actually induces a little bit of stress, not too much, but sort of the Yerkes-Dodson amount, just to make the student alert. And that can be useful to work towards the truth, and Socrates was, good with that. What's talked about is how does one work towards new truth. Bertrand Russell was sort of an interesting philosopher, English philosopher, critic of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And he said that the Platonic dialogue method, Socratic dialogue, was good for talking about things that were already familiar, talking about virtue, talking about justice. But he felt it doesn't work so well when you're talking about things you don't know so well or for doing scientific experiments. Aristotle had summarized all the rhetoric used by the great ancient Greeks for public speaking, and he did a lot of deductive reasoning. Deductive is when you go from a known beginning and work from that. The classic thing is the syllogism. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But Bertrand Russell felt this was not so good of a method for exploring new information and working to new truths. He felt that Aristotle spent too much time with deductive logic and syllogisms and not enough with inductive logic. And it's actually, Aristotle knew about inductive logic. I think, a lot of his books were lost, unfortunately. So it's also been said that deductive thinking is sort of left brain thinking, like a predator working towards a figured out conclusion, versus inductive is more open-ended. And inductive is actually more how you solve complex problems in the real world. All right, so let's see. The best learning in the real world is to figure out what's cause and effect, because that enables you to deal with things in the real world. So here's another quote from Bertrand Russell. What we really know is not that all men are mortal, but rather something like all men born more than 150 years ago are mortal. But this argument is an induction, not a deduction. It yields only a probability, not a certainty. On the other hand, it yields new knowledge, which a deduction does not. All the important inferences outside logic and pure mathematics are inductive, not deductive. The only exceptions are law and theology, where one derives their first principles from an unquestionable text, vis-a-vis, the statute books or the scriptures. So he's making the point that in real life, you need to use inductive logic a lot more than deductive logic. Fair enough. Meaning that you start out not knowing for certain how you're going to work towards the answer. And you basically work towards what's the best probability you can get to reasonably predict the future. Because what we want to do is predict the future. That's why we read history, so we can predict the future. I like the concept of consilience. Consilience means that a bunch of small observations, each one by itself not that strong, but if they all point in the same direction, then that's pretty strong information. So consilience means a bunch of small observations all pointing in the same direction to lead towards a conclusion. So I made up the phrase, consilience leads to resilience in the conclusion. So the more small things you have pointing in one direction, the more likely that conclusion is correct. Bertrand Russell also pointed out inductive logic is nice, make a bunch of observations, see the direction they're pointing in. But on top of that, you also want to figure out the reason why things are being done. Because if you know the reasons why people do things, then you can better predict their behavior. So here's an example Bertrand Russell gives. A turkey was fed every morning by the farmer. By inductive logic, the turkey might assume that this would continue indefinitely, but its throat was cut on Thanksgiving Day. So it's good to know the reasons why people do stuff. Knowing why enables you to make predictions. Aristotle talked a lot about a golden mean, kind of like the Goldilocks principle, having your values in the right position, not overdone, not underdone. Let's see. Let me get to I have a whole bunch of stuff about Aristotle's life and all that stuff. I don't think most people are going to be too interested in that. I have a bunch of jokes about Aristotle. I'm going to kind of skip over that and just go to some of Aristotle's quotes. Aristotle says, "We should study excellence to help us become excellent. I agree. And I think, for example, the public school system is a disgrace. They always talk about, wanting to make everything good for students that are slow, students who are having difficulty, for minority students, for all the students having problems, behavior disorder problems. But what I'm trying to say is I think the schools really have absolute contempt for the smart students. I had a terrible experience when I was in public school. I was suspended numerous times. I was put in solitary confinement called the pod for 2 years by myself because I could do the homework in 5 seconds. And then I would just goof off and try to make my friends laugh. And they would have drugged me nowadays as I was labeled hyperactive. All this BS, simply because there was nothing for me to do. I would just stare out the window. Anyway, so that's what I'm trying to say is there should be respect for excellence in education. Most of the gifted student learning programs, it's all a joke. AP classes are mostly a joke. They're not really enabling students to learn. The kind of good learning I see in the public schools, the rare event is things like that lady who wrote the book, I think her name was Donalyn Miller. She wrote the book, The Book Whisperer. She just let the kids choose their book in 6th grade. They read 42 books a year compared to when kids are forced to read a book, they'll read 3 books the whole year as a class. Okay, Aristotle continues. Humans are better than other animals because humans have reason. There are 2 types of virtue of character and virtue of intellect. Yeah, a person can be a wonderful person and not that smart. I know lots of people who aren't too smart but are great, and I like them very much. My mother wasn't a big academic. She was very smart, but she wasn't an academic. I never saw her read a book in my life. The virtues of intellect, and that might mean somebody is honest with their thought and how they speak. And that's actually quite rare. Surprisingly, like look at the nutrition landscape on the internet. Most of the so-called nutrition experts are phonies pushing all kinds of high-fat foods and other junk. Okay, Aristotle continues. The highest activity of a man is the pursuit of truth. Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is the truth. The life of intellect is the most pleasant and the best life because the intellect is that which is unique about man. Okay, here's a good one by Aristotle continuing. The greatest of all pleasures is the pleasure of learning. The pleasure of learning and contemplation of truth is continuous and enduring. It does not wax and wane like the other pleasures. Yeah, if you enjoy learning, you could read all day, study all day, and that's enjoyable. Aristotle continues. Of all men, the philosopher is the most godlike. Therefore, philosophers are the best men. The aim of art is to show the inward significance of a thing. Okay, Aristotle. And that's very much like the Ayn Rand quote that art is the concretization of metaphysics, meaning that art is the visible manifestation, show of what a person's thinking or what a person thinks important, what they value. Okay, Aristotle continues. There are no prudent young people. Prudence is concerned with specifics as well as universals. Specifics become known from experience. But young people lack experience. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, you can't be a good writer when you're young. You just don't have enough life experience. You can't be a good surgeon when you're young. You could be an expert, by the time you're 25 years old at reading EKGs of the heart because you know all the rules for reading an EKG. But you're not going to know the rare exceptions and the little tricks and mysteries and artifacts that can happen until you've had more experience. Like a surgeon, you can be a good liver transplant surgeon once you've done a couple hundred of them, but you can't be a good liver transplant surgeon when you're, only 30 years old and you don't have that experience. Okay, Aristotle continues. The greatest thing in a writer is to be a master of metaphor. It is the mark of genius to make good metaphors. It is the one thing that cannot be learned from others, because to be good with metaphors indicates a deep understanding of the likeness of things. Aristotle continues on metaphor. Ordinary words convey only what we already know. It is from metaphor that we can best get hold of something new. So in a sense, a metaphor is a lot like inductive logic, like what Bertrand Russell said. Correct. And by the way, Aristotle is a million times smarter than Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell's a little bit of a pain in the ass. Ayn Rand had described him as the Hume of philosophy, which is kind of a joke if you study philosophy, meaning somebody who's always playing games. Aristotle continues. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Bertrand Russell is also part of that whole big money mentality that the proles are a waste of space. He's not very nice or thoughtful about the proles. Okay, Daniel Robinson quote. Aristotle asked basic questions like, what is this thing? Where does it come from? What is it like? How is it different from other things? What is it for? And he said, he who knows the causes of things is happy. Yeah, that's real learning and knowledge in a domain is what causes what, you know. Okay, this then is another quote by Aristotle. Children should learn how to draw. Yeah, and Ruskin said that too. I wish so much I learned how to draw when I was young. That would have given me so much more opportunities in life. Next quote about Daniel Robinson. He has a whole philosophy course with a big section on Aristotle. He says, Aristotle was the first to develop a systematic set of definitions for nature and for psychology. Knowledge begins with the desire to know and then observations. But developed knowledge arrives at universal laws. So you take all the observations, and when they're consistent enough, you can make them into a law, so to speak. Aristotle continues, one learns to play the harp by playing the harp. If a man does not have virtue, then he is the worst of animals. Yeah, that's what happens when you educate people without teaching them about religion. They become amoral scumbags. Okay? Aristotle continues, young men are easy to deceive. He himself had married a princess. You know the story about Phyllis as well. The universal path to great wealth is the creation of a monopoly. Gee, I wonder that's why so many modern corporations are monopolies nowadays. The problem with a monopoly is a monopoly doesn't care who they hire, so monopolies often have poor quality and poor service. And they don't want meritocracy. They won't give a chance to meritocracy to be hired. Okay, Aristotle continues. A man should marry a woman about 15 to 20 years younger than him because he felt that men age better than women. Okay, Aristotle continues. There's people who think that women live longer, but they think that men age better. So we're not going to get into that today. That's a whole other topic, and it depends on a lot of variables. Aristotle continues. The aim of art is to show the inward significance of things. Okay, we kind of went through that before. Aristotle continues, all learning begins with imitation. And that's true too. I mean, you look at all the great artists, they start out by copying the masters. And once they've learned how to do that reasonably well, then they develop their own style and learning the basic techniques in their domain. Aristotle continues, when there is no middle class and the poor greatly exceed in number, troubles arise and the country soon comes to an end. Oh, gee, does that sound like America, where the middle class has been being wiped out and the poverty class is growing and growing and growing? Great. Aristotle continues, great geniuses always have some touch of madness. Okay. Here's a quote by Leonard Peikoff. He's a philosopher, colleague of Ayn Rand. He said, Aristotle is the first thinker to systematize worldliness. Ayn Rand speaks about him. Aristotle tried to categorize the useful knowledge of the known world. Oh, wait a second. Her quote comes later. According to Arthur Schopenhauer, Ayn Rand, and Douglas Hofstadter, the key to improving knowledge is to improve our categories. Yeah, that's true, to get more case experience and more familiar with the nuance of one's domain and then see the generalities and how to connect that to other things. Okay, so Aristotle was the great improver of knowledge. And here's Ayn Rand's quote on Aristotle. Aristotle is the father of individualism. She has a lot of big quotes on Aristotle. She says, everything that makes us civilized beings, every rational value that we possess is a result of Aristotle's influence. Ayn Rand continues, Aristotle may be regarded as a cultural barometer of Western history. Wherever his influence has dominated the scene, it paved the way for one of history's brilliant eras. Whenever it fell, so did mankind. So a good example would be Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. He sort of made Aristotle more acceptable to Catholicism and Catholic communities, and that led his Aristotelian approval and his equating faith and reason as going together really opened up intellectual study in the Catholic Church and in Europe in general, and it led to the Renaissance. So that was one of the great preludes to the Renaissance, the work of Thomas Aquinas, as well as what had come earlier with Charlemagne and Alcuin. Okay, let's see. Aristotle says, before you heal the body, you must first heal the mind. Yeah, it's funny, but that's actually true in the modern world as well. There's tons of people that could easily be cured if they would just heal their mind and use their brain and learn about their disease and its relationship to diet and toxicology, but they seldom do. They just want somebody else to solve their problem for them, and they never get better. Aristotle says happiness is the ultimate goal of philosophy. Oh, and there were some people who did not like Aristotle. Martin Luther, for example, hated him. Martin Luther, got to remember, was an Augustinian monk. Augustine was sort of influenced by Plato, and so they didn't like Aristotelian thought so much. Martin Luther said, "It pains me to the heart that this damnable, arrogant, pagan rascal has seduced and fooled so many of the best Christians with his misleading writings." Martin Luther had a whole bunch of nasty things to say about Aristotle. Martin Luther was kind of crazy, but he's more entertaining than most Christian writers. Most of them are Christian theologian writers are kind of boring. Okay, Aristotle continues. All men by nature desire to know. All intelligent men. Aristotle continues. To facilitate rational thought, we must control our emotions. He said the first step to an intelligent conversation is for us to control our emotions. Okay, Aristotle said, all men are created unequal in ability, and everybody knows that. Some guys are faster runners, so if you're going to have a competition in running, the fast guy's going to win. He's unequal. He's better at running. Some guys are taller. That gives them an advantage at a sport like basketball, where tall is a height. That gives them an advantage at being a pitcher in baseball, because a tall guy usually has long arms and can throw a ball faster, okay? Some guys are better at math. Some guys have better verbal skills. Everybody knows that. Some people are better looking than others. Some people are fatter or skinnier than others, even if they eat the same diet. It's just the way life is. Everybody should have equal opportunity, but it's a fact that people are not equal in ability. Everybody knows that. Aristotle continues, poetry is more worthy of serious attention than is history. History treats particular facts, whereas poetry is concerned with universal truths. History only tells us what has been, but poetry tells us how things ought to be. That's actually a very profound statement. So what he's basically saying is good literature, and like for him it was things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Idiot and the Odyssey, as well as all the great plays, like Aeschylus, Aristophanes, Sophocles, Euripides, okay, because they inspire a person to, be the best they can be. Aristotle continues, that which we learn by doing. Intelligence is more than a knowledge of a task. Intelligence is also the ability to perform the task. A shipbuilder builds ships. Like some guy could, read a book about cars, but that's not the same as a guy who knows how to change the oil, change the tires, and fix the carburetor and all the other stuff in the car. The guy who's got that hands-on practical knowledge, that's a lot more valuable. Aristotle, this is a quote about Aristotle, by Daniel Robinson from his philosophy course. For Aristotle to know something meant that he knew the cause of it, to know the causes by which things are brought about. Aristotle says the proof that you know something is that you can teach it to others. Yeah, that's a great way to learn, is to teach something to others. A lot of times a great way to learn is to write a book about something. So it's a motivator to really put it all together. I kind of like the Feynman method of writing your own little mini book for yourself on a word processor about a topic, and once you really got a good master of it, then you're ready to teach about it. And if you keep on studying a longer and longer time and feel comfortable with it and want to, you could even write a book about it at that point. But you don't want to write a book too soon, or it'll be a half-assed book. Aristotle continues, there's only one way to avoid criticism. That is to do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. Aristotle continues, courage is the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees the others. The high-minded man, he must care more for the truth than for what people think. And then here's another interesting one. He says, when we think, we speculate in pictures. A dog has no words, but it can remember many things. Therefore, a dog thinks in pictures. A chimpanzee has no words, but he can remember many things. Humans are a primate. It therefore seems reasonable to conclude that humans speculate in pictures. Okay, that ending analysis there, that was all my words. Aristotle made the original quote that we speculate in pictures. The rest was sort of my analysis of it. And given the fact that we speculate in pictures, we should teach with pictures and with stories. Our brain's made for stories. I forget who it was who said that our brain is not a logic processor. Our brain is a story processor. That's why everything is easier to understand in the form of a story. And also pictures are great. Look at all the illiterate peasants in the history of Christianity. They were taught in Catholicism especially by looking at the pictures on the wall in the church and then having a priest or somebody talk about it. Here's a quote by Kieran Egan and Gillian Judson. They wrote a book called Imagination and the Engaged Learner. Here's what they say. The story makes it easier to remember the topic. The story tells the student how they should feel or think about the topic. Yep. If you want somebody to remember something, it's good to put it in a story. Give some type of example, a picture, something that's connected to emotions. Emotions last much longer in the memory. Also, it should be directly relevant to the person. That makes them remember it better as well. Okay, here's a quote by Will Durant. The tragedy of life is that it gives us wisdom only after it has stolen youth. Oh yeah, that's my most common daydream, to go back to being young and fix all the stupid things I did. You know, the girl I was in love with, to stay with her maybe. It's too late. You don't get to do it over again. By the time a man can read a woman like a book, he needs bifocals. That's an anonymous quote. Aristotle says, the family is the association established by nature for a supply of man's everyday needs. Yep. We're designed to have families, to live in families, and then help each other. The style of a family is to help each other. Cooperation is when you get out in society that there's a lot of competition. And Christianity, if people actually live by it, it makes them a lot nicer to each other, almost nice like they would be to a family. Not quite. Non-family will never be family, but they can be closer to it. Aristotle continues, education is the best provision for old age. Well begun is half done. The essence of rhetoric is persuasion, and he was the expert in rhetoric, wrote an entire book on it. Aristotle continues, it is easy to praise Athenians amongst Athenians. It is hard to praise Athenians amongst Spartans. Okay. The intellect, this is again Aristotle, the intellect is the most divine thing about us. To strive and improve the intellect is the most noble thing we can do. The philosopher who strives to optimize the intellect does as great a thing that is as close as possible to the divine. And then here he is talking about beauty. He says, beauty is better than all the letters of recommendation in the world. Yeah, I had seen one thing a little bit funny. I noticed when I was working at this one hospital many years ago that there was lady residents from a country. This was from Poland. And the pretty females from that country with male bosses choosing the residents, like almost all the pretty girls that were doctors from the other country got residencies, and a lot of the not pretty ones did not. And then I noticed something else related to that. Where there's a female as a boss, the less attractive women are more likely to get a job than the pretty one because they see the pretty one as competition. Anyways, I thought that was interesting. I'm not the only one who made that observation. There were a couple of male doctors all talking about that all came to the same conclusion in that time ago, years ago. Aristotle continues, if you would understand anything, observe its beginning and its development and see how it is made. Aristotle continues, the fate of empires depends on the education of the youth. Aristotle continues, the more you know that you don't know. It helps a speaker to convince us if we are to believe that he has certain qualities himself, namely goodness or goodwill towards us, or both. Think as wise men think, but speak with the words that the simple people use. Of all the aspects of rhetoric, the most important is the perceived standing of the speaker himself. Character may be called the most effective means of persuasion. In order to solve a problem, you first have to know what the problem really is, in the same way that you can't untie a knot until you found the knot. Aristotle continues, the worst form of inequality is to try to make unequal things equal. Yeah, that's a lot of times what's happening in the modern world. The only way to make everybody equal is to make them a bunch of poor slaves. Okay, other than that, there's always going to be some inequality. Okay, Aristotle, of course, was very much in favor of education. Here's his next quote. Educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead. Okay, pretty strong statement. The family is the invention of nature to supply man's wants. That's the same quote from before, translated a little differently. Aristotle continues, teaching is the highest form of understanding. Okay. Aristotle was a biology, interested in animals, classifying animals, kind of doing some first serious biology. Alexander the Great had his men retrieve unique animal specimens, and they would be sent back to Aristotle to be categorized. Okay, here's a quote by Charles Darwin. Linnaeus and Cuvier have been my two gods, but they were mere schoolboys compared to Aristotle. Yeah, Aristotle broke ground in a lot of different fields and really summarized them well. The guy was an incredible genius, okay? Some of the things you hear that make fun of him quotes are not actually true, okay? And a lot of what we have from him is the notes of his students, and it's still awesomely brilliant coming through his students. Okay, here's another Aristotle quote. The tyrant who, in order to hold power, suppresses every superiority, suppresses the great people, will do away with good men, and he will forbid education and light. Okay, a little side, in China for 10 years, they wouldn't let people go to college or something like that. Okay, so anyways, Aristotle continues. The tyrant controls every movement of the citizens and keeps them under perpetual servitude, and he wants them to grow accustomed to baseness and cowardice, to go along with whatever gaslighting BS comes down the pike for that year. Okay, Aristotle continues. He will have spies everywhere to listen to what is said in meetings, and he will spread dissension and calumny amongst the citizens to impoverish them, and he will be obliged to stir up conflicts to keep his subjects occupied and impose on them a permanent need of a demagogue. Okay, Aristotle, thank you. And Aristotle, they did have slavery back in ancient Greece, and all ancient societies had slavery, You look in the Bible, there's a lot of slavery in the Old Testament. There's been slavery in all these ancient cultures. Christianity finally put an end to it, but it took a long time, obviously. And the British brutalized the Irish for like 1,000 years, and they still do. Okay, Will Durant continues. Aristotle's mind shaped the education of mankind for more time than any other. Yeah, Aristotle's influence had a bigger effect on educating people than anyone else that ever lived, except for Jesus. Okay, and his was more of a regular education rather than religious education. Of course, we talked about all that stuff. All right, so that's actually it then. What I got for Aristotle. I hope that was helpful and interesting.